It's about trying to find ways of elevating films which may not have a significant market budget. How can I work with those films? How can I work with my local audience, my local community, to get them to see that as something they want to see?
This is the Box Office Podcast. I'm Daniel Loria, the editorial director of Box Office Pro, the pulse of theatrical exhibition. And in this week's episode, we have a couple of guests. To start things off, we'll be speaking with Dan Burke and Robert Olson, the directors of Novocaine, coming out this weekend in North America from Paramount Pictures. And in our feature segment, we've got Phil Clapp, the head of the UK Cinema Association, which will be celebrating its annual conference on March 18 and 19 at the Picture House Central in London. We'll be going over that upcoming event and a quick recap on where the UK cinema industry is today. A big recovery. We've seen some big box office hits in the last couple of months over there in the UK. But before we get into that, I am joined by my colleagues and co-hosts Rebecca Pahle and Chad Kennerk of Box Office Pro. Guys, welcome back. Opening this the way we always do. I know Rebecca went to the movies.
I caught the Dolby Atmos re-release of Purple Rain. It was really fun. It was almost sold out. Everyone was wearing some purple. Sounded great. My boyfriend and I just kept going like, is it tied to anything? Is there like a 4K release? Is there an anniversary? I'm like, I don't think so. I think they just wanted to put it in Atmos for one day to get like ticket sales on a Wednesday, and I will take it. It was really great.
Was the auditorium full or like halfway? What did it look like on a Wednesday night?
There was one empty seat next to me, but other than that, it looked full. And people were like taking the pictures with the poster and everything.
Oh, great.
Nice.
Off-peak Wednesday rep screening at a major circuit and Dolby Atmos.
Yep.
That's what we like to see. We really want to see more of these off-peak one-offs to get the super fan community involved, excited. I've never seen the movie. Chad, are you a Prince guy? Are you a Purple Rain guy?
You know, it's been a long time since I've seen it, but one thing that I read, I wanted to ask Rebecca about, it was scanned from the original camera negative. It was like an 8K scan. How did it look in Dolby?
Oh, it looked great. I hadn't heard about that, but it looked amazing. I mean, we were in the second row and Eric was kind of concerned, like, second row, but in Dolby Atmos, that's still decently far back. Like even the front row would be great. But yeah, it looked amazing. I'm not sure how how this came about with AMC and then Dolby, but I am glad it did.
Yeah, welcome surprise on the off-peak period. And now this weekend, we've got a slew of new releases from Paramount. We've got Novocaine. We've got those filmmakers speaking to us shortly. From Focus Features, we've got the Steven Soderbergh movie Black Bag from A24. We've got Opus. And then from Ketchup Entertainment, picking up a discarded title from Warner Brothers, The Day the Earth Blew Up, a Looney Tunes movie. All of those coming out this weekend, all of them fighting for screens. Meanwhile, you've got Anora out there, like with a nice Oscar Best Picture bump at the box office. Nice to see that hitting new heights. A lot of options at the movies, guys. Any plans to go this weekend?
I'm actually going to see Black Bag tonight, so I'm looking forward to it.
Nice. Yeah, that's on my list. That's the one I want to go to.
I might. So I saw Mickey 17 at an earlier screening, and Eric and a friend of his saw it over the weekend. And talking about it with him, I might go see Mickey 17 again.
Really? That good? Well, I'm glad to hear that. That needs help.
But interesting. Like I cannot stop thinking about some of the choices that this movie made, and I have the subscription service, so like it's basically free.
Interesting is always better than good, Rebecca. I will go to the grave with that motto. Interesting keeps you thinking about these movies, and if it leads to another visit, good for everyone involved.
You should see Mickey 17 if interesting is better than good, which it is.
Well, moviegoers will have their option from that stack of movies. Unfortunately, it is expected to be a quieter weekend here. The March box office won't really get back up and running until the release of Disney's Snow White, the live-action remake coming out next weekend. And for our latest forecast on that, please go to boxofficepro.com, where we update these titles on a weekly basis every Wednesday and Friday. Other than that, guys, it's a long episode. We don't want to keep our listeners waiting. Let's just go right into Chad Kennerk's conversation with Novocaine directors Dan Burke and Robert Olson. Chad, before we go into it, what was your biggest takeaway from that conversation?
Well, first, I have to say Novocaine is a blast. I hope moviegoers check this out because it's so much fun to see in a theater with an audience. Of course, this is a high concept action comedy about an everyman that can't feel pain. So there's a lot of humor that comes along with that. He's not a superhero. He just can't feel the excruciating pain happening to his body throughout. Yeah, just a witty script. And I had a great conversation with Dan and Robert. Everything from mapping out the many injuries in the movie to the importance of pie, which you always have to talk about. This is a great pie movie. It's coming out on Pie Day, 3/14.
Nice.
And it's also in a number of premium formats, including 4DX, which I didn't get to see it in, but I can only imagine that experience. And I talked to them about their experience with 4DX.
Co-starring Amber Midthunder, star of Prey, obligatory Paramount. Release Prey in theaters as an event cinema release when the new Predator movie comes out.
Big fans of Prey over here. Massive campaign that we will do on a grassroots level to get Prey on a movie theater screen. Please, anyone listening that can make that happen, we will be very excited for that. And following that conversation with the directors of Novocaine is my conversation with Phil Clapp, the head of the UK Cinema Association. That is coming up after the break.
Hi, Dan. Hi, Robert. Thank you so much for joining us on the Box Office podcast. I love the big screen experience, and this is a film everyone should see with an audience. Nate's journey is a labor of love, and this project feels like a labor of love as well. Robert, was the production as much of a roller coaster ride for you as it was for me as an audience member watching it?
You know, the production itself had a lot less drama than the movie has, I'll say, but it did have all of the heart and humor that the movie had. You know, I think part of it is we had just an incredible cast between Jack and Amber and Ray and Betty and Matt. Like, everyone was so friendly and nice and down to earth. And there weren't any, there were no bad apples. You know, usually on a movie set, it's either the most fun thing in the world and it's like adult summer camp and every day is incredible, or you might have somebody who's like a bit of an a-hole that's high up the food chain, whether that's your lead actor or a director or a producer. You know, we've worked on plenty of sets before we got to direct. You know, we've PA'd and key PA'd and seconded and all these things. So we've been on sets where the vibe is not great, and that is anything but fun. So we always just try to foster a really positive working environment. And I think that, you know, I think a lot of the good vibes come from the fact that we are best friends and have been since we were 18 years old. And so, you know, we just try to infuse as much of that energy into the projects that we make. And I think this one was the first time where that really got to be amplified by the concept. You know, I think up until this point, we've done a lot of horrors and thrillers that we put a lot of humor and heart into, but this one we didn't, you know, we got to really kind of just take the restrictor plate off and really allow it to be this fun celebration of friendship and romance and all these things. And so even though there's a lot of grisly violence and broken bones and rended flesh, by the end of the movie, you actually feel pretty good. You know, you don't leave on some sour note, and we love that.
Right. From the big set pieces to the prosthetics, the makeup, you have a lot to navigate there. Dan, what was the most challenging moment or aspect of the shoot for you?
Well, listen, for us, none of it was really hard physically for us, but I do think tracking a lot of that continuity was probably the biggest challenge with this movie. We had all of the, it's like 109 different sort of like wounds, lacerations, bruising, this and that. There were like 17 or 18 different versions of the suit, you know, the various levels of breakdown for Nate's costume. So all of that had to be, you know, tracked with 3D scans of Jack and with our, you know, and we'd sort of be able to go through and give notes on this and that. And so our amazing special effects makeup team led by Clinton Smith and our costumes, it was just a lot to sort of wrap one's head around. But we did our best to shoot the film chronologically as much as one can. You know, we started, our first few days were in Nate's apartment. our final shot was, in the climactic fight, we at least attempted as best we could to take the pressure off some of those department heads on that. But that was definitely probably the biggest to-do on this set, was making sure that, Jack didn't show up with bruising on his face that he hasn't actually acquired yet because, these days were swapped or whatever. That was a big job.
So essentially, you had a few weeks of shooting a rom-com and then went in a completely different direction.
Yeah, I mean, it really was. It was 2 weeks of shooting a rom-com, and it's funny because Jack and Amber were working together almost the entirety of those first 2 weeks, and then after the bank heist, there was a 4-week gap where we didn't see Amber. Amber didn't work, and Amber and Jack really didn't get another chance to work together until way later in the shoot, and they really missed each other, which was very sweet.
Yeah, and I'm sure that kind of plays into all of the scenes you shot in between as well.
Yeah,
sure.
Definitely.
Yeah. Take me into your prep, into your collaborative process. As creative partners, how do you approach mapping that out, especially with a film like this where there are so many things to track?
Sure. So, we learned kind of early on in our careers that, prep is where the movie is won or lost. If you prep a movie properly, the actual shooting of it is just pure fun. I think that prep is where you're really hitting the books and kind of making sure that everything is all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed and all that. And I think
eating your veggies.
Yeah, exactly. It is the vegetables, and then the shooting is the dessert. It's just fun. Not to say that there aren't like things that happen in acts of God on set that it's possible for that to be not fun. But on this movie, the shooting was very fun. But I think a big reason that prep was so successful on this is our AD, Justin Muller. We were one of the first films up and running after the strike. And so we had the opportunity to work with some really talented department heads who maybe in a more normal environment might have been on a bigger show, and so Justin, the last movie he had AD'd was Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, which obviously has a lot more going on, is many, many times the budget of this movie, and it has mocap and all these crazy CGI things. And so, when he came to this, it's not like he was, just sitting there and coasting and, oh, this is easy. He brought that same level of hyper-focus and detail-oriented leadership to our production office. And, so we were having meeting after meeting every day, sequence meetings, wound meetings, fight meetings, just making sure that everyone was on the same page and that our schedule made sense. And I think the amount of work that was put into that just made the whole shoot that much better. It allowed us to have shorter days so that you weren't burning out the crew. I think that everybody had a really fun time making this movie, but again, that is all just because of the hard work that the whole crew and team put in the early days before you ever get to set.
I love that this is a return to character-driven action stories with a personal stakes rather than global stakes. What were some of the films that you had in mind when you were putting Novocaine together?
Yeah, I mean, you hit it right on the head. We kind of feel like, action is probably our favorite genre, and we sort of feel like at some point in the last 20 years, it's kind of lost some of what made us fall in love with it in the first place, which were, in what we consider the golden age of action, is these relatable protagonists, in the 80s and 90s, whether it's John McClane in Die Hard or Riggs and Murtaugh in the Lethal Weapon franchise or Jack Walsh in The Duke in Midnight Run. You've got those movies were starring guys that could live on your block. They weren't like gardeners that were secretly assassins or bakers that were in Mossad or something. They're just regular people thrust into extraordinary circumstance, which makes it more relatable and it makes it more satisfying for an audience member to watch that journey because you can map your own experience onto the main character's experience, and that's just something you don't get a lot anymore in action films these days. And I think a lot of action movies in the contemporary era have taken on a little bit more of a dour tone, a little more cynical, and that's probably a response to real life events. It's like a post 9/11, post Great Recession reaction that art often has to huge global events like that. But despite the world being a little scary out there, like we're trying to inject a little joy back into that because action movies used to be that way. You used to go to the movie theater and have so much fun and go on a ride and leave the movie theater feeling better about humanity than when you walked in. And that's kind of always our ethos as filmmakers, no matter what we're working on. And right now we feel like there's a lot of opportunity to move the action genre in that direction.
Yeah, and it's funny what you said about stakes too, because that's such a good point, is that, stakes are always relative to your movie. It's okay to have your stakes be this person trying to save the one person they love, because I think you see it a lot in bigger action movies and superhero movies. The stakes are always going up, up, up. It's like, okay, the stakes of this are like a nuclear bomb might go off. Okay, the stakes of this are the whole world might end. Okay, the stakes of this are that not only our world, but every other world and every other multiverse might end. And at a certain point, like, you can't go any bigger. And so you can't keep trying to outdo the last movie. You have to find what are the stakes of your movie, because that's all that really matters.
Yeah, we built it so high that it's like you have to get into a fictional realm to even wrap your head around the stakes of some of these movies. And at that point, you just don't care because there aren't 10,000 multiverse, whatever. Either way, yes. We're very happy with our nice, modest stakes in this.
There's also this messaging of embracing yourself and sort of removing some of the shame or stigma around a disability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a big priority for us. We wanted to try to tell an empowering story about somebody who takes a disability and takes this thing that they're insecure about and turns that into an asset, and it becomes the engine of their success. Because, while Nate has this very rare disorder, most people don't have that, but everyone can relate to being insecure about something or feeling in a rut or feeling like you're in a gloomy place in your life. And we just think that there is real opportunity for wish fulfillment in saying, oh yeah, that thing that you're insecure about, that actually might be an asset for you. You might be able to use that to succeed in whatever endeavor you might be working on. And it seems like people are relating to that idea on a very foundational basis.
Yeah, it's something that people can relate to, like we were talking about stakes, and that being the global stakes maybe I can't relate to, but I can relate to someone that I care about being in trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And what would you do for love? It's a question that has driven many movies, but it's kind of evergreen, because love it's the most powerful thing in the universe. It's as old as our species, and it'll exist forever. It's a very, very potent sort of pillar to build your movie around.
There's multiple premium formats that this is coming out in, including 40X, and I want to know if you guys have seen it in 40X yet.
We absolutely have. I mean, I wouldn't call it seen it as much as felt it. It is intense, and it was, but it's awesome because it's so fun. And I mean, that was our first time in 40X. I think we'd done some similar. We did like D-Box and stuff, but that was our first 40X experience, and it was really cool. I mean, just the way that, the little air bursts that you get when a bullet flies by, the way that when there's a slow motion scene, your seat is kind of doing this kind of thing. And I think it's just another way to make the movie even more immersive. And I think for this movie, it really works because, you kind of get this little, as the first, 25 minutes of the movie are kind of a rom-com. So when you're watching it in 40X, you almost forget it's 40X for a little bit. And then all of a sudden, the action starts and your chair's going all over the place and you just wind up having such a blast. And, I think it's one of those things that I personally just love it because you can't look at your phone when you're watching a 40X movie, and I hate looking around a theater and seeing people looking at their phone or checking their Apple Watch or whatever. But when you're in that 40X seat, you better hold on, or you're gonna lose your drink and your popcorn, So it's I love that it really forces you to engage. And the audience that we spoke with, we were there for a Q&A after a 40X screening, and everybody loved it. They had such a fun time in there, and so I'm really excited just to see how many people wind up seeing this in 40X.
Yeah, me too. Robert, you mentioned dessert earlier. We have to talk about pie, guys.
Yeah.
I think this is going to go down in the pantheon of great pie movies.
Yeah, what else do we have? There's Ghost Story. There's the chocolate pie in Ghost Story that she eats.
There's a lot of stuff. I mean, I'm always thinking of it in terms of
Labor Day.
Yeah, totally. Or just I know less of a but Twin Peaks is another one that I just there's so much pie in that, and the pie that they talk about in the diner is just so delicious sounding. They love. There's always we were watching a lot of we were watching Reacher when we were in prep, and there's a great pie scene in that show too.
Good pie
People love pie. It's a great thing. In fact, we wound up getting tattoos at the end of this shoot of,
You did not.
of,
That's
the,
awesome.
of the pie.
It's the exact illustration
Yeah.
that Sherry puts on the paper for Nate.
Yeah, so
That's
we had like
amazing.
we had a
I
tattoo
love
consultant there who was just like, there to make sure that anytime Nate was using a tattoo gun that he looked like a professional. And then at the end of the shoot, we were just kind of like, hey man, you want to give us some actual tattoos? And he was cool enough and just came over to our house and we got these 2 little simple tattoos and it was great. And then, next time you see us, we might just be tatted up
That's
head
right.
to toe,
Well, and it was
We're hooked.
all of the whole cast and all the producers said they were going to do it too, and so Bobby and I did
Liars.
it, and then no one else did. We were like, "We're going streaking. Who's coming?" And then nobody joined us.
Oh
But that's
my
okay.
God.
We're happy we have them.
Exactly.
That's great. I love that. From being randomly assigned, right, as roommates
Yes, sir.
in college to your first film was $50K, right?
Yeah.
So have you had a moment to reflect back on your journey so far as filmmakers and creative partners?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we do that all the time. We're very sensitive boys. We're very cerebral about this stuff, and we're constantly taking inventory and kind of just realizing how fortunate we are that we've been able to navigate up to this level, because it's very easy in Hollywood. I mean, the old adage, you can be, up 1 minute, down the next. Like it definitely is true. And we've pitched hundreds of things that have gotten rejected.
much
We're always
rejection.
collecting no's. And so, we've certainly never been in danger of losing perspective and just feeling like, oh, it's being handed to us. It's you claw for every inch in this business. And that's one of the reasons that we're sort of cherishing this moment right now. We have a movie that we're so proud of that's coming out on around the world on 3,200 screens in the U.S. alone. Like, that is really special, and we realize that. We realize that we're just so lucky to be in that position.
Yeah, I think the first time that I saw a billboard for our movie, like near my apartment, it was so surreal, and I think that was something that you dream about it when you're a kid, shooting dumb little Lord of the Rings spoofs with your friends and stuff like that. To finally be in this place where we have a movie that's coming out wide, it really is like a dream come true. And I just remember being really emotional the first time I saw like a big outdoor advertisement for something that we poured so much of ourselves into. There's something validating about that. It's a scary thing sometimes working in an artistic field and being creative professional, because when your work doesn't work, it feels personal. You know what I mean? And you feel bad about yourself when somebody doesn't like something that you make. And so when you pull it off and you make something that is at least pretty darn good, it's a really validating feeling.
To close us out, do you have any foundational movie-going moments at the theater that shaped you as filmmakers?
I remember after I saw Titanic, I was so taken by it that I had a whole pack of Twinkies that was left unopened that I hadn't eaten, and I just kind of placed it on the ground for like the victims of that tragedy and left. I remember doing that. Yeah,
That's a normal thing for a fifth grader.
I'm
to do.
sure that made it better for all of them.
Yeah, I think it probably did.
Yeah.
I sometimes mention this, that I think the first theatrical experience I remember having, and I probably went to the movie theaters many times before this, but I smoked so much weed freshman year of college that I think I deleted a bunch of early life memories. But
It happens.
my dad took me to see Scream in theaters when I was like 9, and I just remember being like, oh my God, because that movie has some really great subtle genre blending going on, where it's these really horrifying moments, indelible scare moments that certainly stuck with me. I'm sure gave me lots of nightmares in the subsequent days and months, but it's also so funny, and I think that, Bobby and I both have a sort of natural tendency to genre blend. Like, everything we work on tends to exist somewhere in the margins between genres. And I feel like that was probably a pretty foundational theatrical experience. I remember walking out in the parking lot and thinking that was so cool, and I didn't realize you could do that. So maybe you can draw a line from Scream to Novocaine. I don't know. I guess Jack actually is a part of the Scream franchise, so
There you go.
that is nice.
Yeah, there you go.
And that was Chad Kennerk from Box Office Pro speaking with Novocaine filmmakers Dan Burke and Robert Olson. Now coming up is my interview with the UKCA head Phil Clapp, going over the event coming up on March 18th and 19th at the Picture House Central in London, the UKCA annual conference. That conversation coming up right after this break. And we're back here on the Box Office Podcast in this special UKCA edition with Phil Clapp, the head of the UK Cinema Association. Phil, welcome back. It's great to have you.
Good to be here. Thanks, Daniel.
Let's get into this event because there's going to be so many panels, so many different sessions. But for our international listeners, let's set the stage because the UK has seen some great box office hits out of the last 6 months alone. Titles like Paddington in Peru and Wicked, Bridget Jones, the latest sequel, which unfortunately went straight to streaming here in the US, made great numbers in the UK. What's going on in there? How did you figure this out before anybody else did?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, of course, I wouldn't be doing the job I do. But it's absolutely true to say that 2024 for us was the kind of comeback story. We had a challenging first 6-7 months, as most did, but then the final 2 or 3 months went great guns. I think both November and December were 50% plus up at least on the previous year's equivalent months. And then as we come into 2025, as you say, Bridget Jones has just crossed £40 million at the UK box office, has given a much needed fit up alongside all of the awards films, Conclave being probably the most prominent of those. So we're in a good place. And actually, there's no better time to bring together the various clans of the cinema sector than at a time when the industry is doing well.
Yeah, it's really been a great story from the UK side, but there are still challenges. Of course, we know that the strike wasn't only a United States issue. It was a global issue. And we saw that in the UK box office, really in the entirety of 2024. We might still have some lingering impacts here. I'm talking about things like low slate awareness, really forcing exhibitors to innovate to make sure that audiences know what's going on in their local cinema with less studio product. You have some sessions here on the schedule at the UKCA event that address these issues. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think we're very conscious. We began kind of an all industry survey of cinema audiences during the pandemic, and we've done it regularly since. And one of the things which undoubtedly has remained a concern has been low levels of slate awareness. Now, because we didn't do the surveys before the pandemic, we don't really know whether they're lower than they were before, but they're still kind of seem to us very, very low in terms of people's anticipation of what's coming down the line and awareness. And some of that is about frequency of cinema going and the opportunities to put trailers in front of people. But also it's also about the fact it's a much noisier media world now with lots of things fighting for people's attention. So one of the sessions at our conference is around what can we do? What are the different channels? What are the different approaches? What are the different hook points to raise people's awareness of the upcoming titles? I think, it was always the case that people on the cinema side had to lean in to the marketing of upcoming titles. But even more so now, I think, colleagues in the studios and distributors have always carried the burden of this. But with the costs of marketing, the costs of advertising, it's really, it will ill serve the industry for cinemas not to use the channels and the direct contact they have with, existing and maybe lapsed customers to get them aware and interested and excited about what's coming down the track.
Yeah, it's a super important part of this industry, just making sure that the films that are coming out have that sort of visibility, but you have to direct that somewhere. And we know that a huge part of this industry are young audiences, and that can create its own challenges. I know in countries like France, that seems to be a common refrain from my colleagues in the industry there. How do we get young audiences back? Here in the US, young audiences have TikTok that they've really latched onto. We've seen great increases in frequency based on that. What's the situation in the UK, Phil? Because I see here on the schedule on day one, a session targeting young audiences and another one on how to market to Gen Z moviegoers specifically.
We run this conference every year and we try to make it something which gives people kind of practical takeouts. You can talk about, the strategic direction of the industry, you can talk about trends, but really we want to, particularly for our members who are the broad range of UK cinema operators. We want to give them some kind of practical takeouts. So one of the things we did last year for the first time was we brought together a panel of young cinema goers, and asked them, with no set script, with no, kind of opinions out of bounds, what were the things they liked about the cinema going experience? What were the things they change about it? And we're repeating that this year because I think, the feedback we got from audiences was an unusual experience for them to really focus in on that audience, which, is always been a particularly important audience segment, but clearly is the audience of now and tomorrow. So we'll repeat that. And what we've done this time is we've asked Interfilm, who are a charity we work with, who work with children and young people around watching, making, and understanding film. We've asked them to ensure that, that panel is not just made up of cinephiles, that made up of also of maybe casual cinema goers and maybe even Latin cinema goers. So we get the broad range of views. But then following that, the next session, as you say, is around the particular challenges of marketing to Gen Z and Gen Alpha, and I probably need to go online to work out what the difference is between those and where I don't fit in amongst.
Yeah,
those,
we're running out of alphabet here, Phil.
Yeah, no,
the alphabet's gone.
Absolutely.
We're now into Greek numerals. It's difficult.
We're in a post-gen generation, I think. But the reality is, I think, is that one of the real lessons and one of the real, kind of takeouts of the period, particularly post-pandemic, where, as I say, young people, everyone is inundated with many more kind of bits of noise and marketing chatter, as it were, is finding where those young people are, where are they picking up their information, where are they forming their opinions, and where are they being influenced. And so, I dare say that many of the larger cinema companies and certainly many of the studios and larger film distributors have people who are expert in that. But we're very conscious when we run our conferences that, once you step outside of the big circuits who have the bandwidth, no pun intended, to deal with these things, we have a very large number. By far, the majority of our members are small single site operators who really don't have the expertise or maybe even the networks to tackle these issues. So the session which we're running on marketing to Gen Z and Gen Alpha will not just pick up from some of the people whose job this is to do within, Cineworld, for example, one of the larger operators over here, and Sony Pictures, but also we've got a representative from Snapchat, for example, which is increasingly seemingly an area where young people are picking up their news around films and their excitement and the buzz around films. How can I, as a small single site operator, putting myself in their shoes, how can I tap into that? How can I take advantage of that, full in the knowledge that I've probably got 25,000 other things I need to do during any working week?
Yeah, I think it's a very important spotlight here that we have to look at what your marketing equation looks like. And of course, a good place to look into are the compens that have worked in recent months. You've also got colleagues from Universal coming to speak about the success story of Wicked in the UK market, which I remember when this thing opened, it was breaking records left and right. I think it's a great initiative that you can go to distribution and say, like, hey, let's do a postmortem on something that worked really well and what lessons we can come out of it with.
Yeah, we did something similar last year on Barbie and Wonka. Barbie and Wonka, colleagues at Warner Brothers Discovery did it on Barbie and Wonka. And I think, sometimes because it's a very hand-to-mouth existence, there's this film and I need to work on this, and there's this film and I need to work on this. People don't have the opportunity necessarily to stock take what worked and what didn't work, and not everything works. But also on the cinema side of the business, quite often they don't see, they don't necessarily get a chance to consider and have sight of what happens below the surface of these things. They see the big posters, they see the digital screens, they see the social media campaign, but what was the planning? What was the thinking behind this? And hopefully then they can think, no matter what size of cinema they are, how can I tap into this? How can I use that collateral or those assets to, market to my audience? Not every film will have the marketing budget of a Barbie or a Wonka or certainly of a Wicked, for example. But hopefully there are some kind of general rules of application that exposing these things to broader scrutiny, which allow people to take advantage of.
Yeah, I think that's another great focus here in looking at how to grow your audience base, making sure you're engaging with those viewers. And related to that theme, going now into day two, my colleague here from the box office company, Malcolm McMillan, is going to be moderating a panel speaking with different executives from the industry that are applying marketing techniques from outside of cinema to sort of engage audiences once again. I think it's a really interesting lesson because, listen, you know as well as I do, Phil, that this is an industry that was built and grows on all of the experience that we've had. But it's always great to have those folks that come from outside of exhibition that can infuse new ideas into the business. And that's exactly what this panel has, getting in executives from National Amusements, Omniplex, and Odeon.
Yeah, I'm always been a strong believer that, while there is a lot that being learnt from inside the industry, from fellow cinema operators or studios or distributors, equally there are always things that can be learnt from other industries. And sometimes those dots aren't as easy to join as they might be. But certainly with the colleagues that are joining for the panel on day two of the conference, they're all now part of the weave, as it were, of the cinema industry. But fairly recently, they've come in from sport and leisure or events or hospitality, etc. And, given the kind of overlapping interests and overlapping, elements of the business models of those, certainly with regard to cinema operation, I think it's always interesting to hear, even if it's unconsciously on occasions, the things that they have brought into their day-to-day work in the sector. And as I say, not all of those things will be things which necessarily everyone can apply, but it does give you a sense of the fact that, and I think everyone knows this, we're not the sole holders of the kind of the wisdom here, essentially. And there are always things we can pick up from other industries. And, we've attempted to do that with previous of our events. And I'd like to think it's one of the kind of the threads that kind of joins these events, is that we're not entirely, inwardly focused. We are looking at, and we are looking where we can learn more.
Of course, a big draw to audiences in the post-pandemic era has been new cinema technology. PLF is the new buzzword in this industry, premium large format. But it's not the Band-Aid, right? It's not a magic elixir that you can just say PLF, magically conjure hundreds of thousands of pounds and put it in your site. We are in a situation right now where we are forced to elevate the big screen experience, sometimes without the capital that we would like to have to apply those changes. And you're addressing that in one of these panel sessions at this event. Could you speak on the importance of that innovation so we don't just always rely on the biggest buzzword out there?
We're always very conscious of our audience, and our primary audience for these events, although we welcome all comers, are primarily our smaller operator members who often don't have the networks or the bandwidth to necessarily engage with big ticket items like data use and digital marketing and technology to a degree. And so, either for that reason, or sometimes simply because there's always been a premium on resource, never more so than now. Some of the things which they might most readily do are not things which necessarily involve significant financial outlay. And I think, as you said at the outset, we're although we've seen a good recovery over the last 3 months, we're still very much a sector in recovery. And so, the economic resources are not as healthy as they might be. So it would be almost tone deaf of us to hold a conference which was solely around, you need to invest in this and find some more money for this. There are lots of things which are already underway. Some things which are you can identify as a specific strand of action, others which are part of the day-to-day for our members, where they are innovating, and they probably wouldn't call it that, but it's about eventizing the cinema experience. It's about trying to find ways of elevating films which may not have a significant market budget. How can I work with those films? How can I work with my local audience, my local community, to get them to see that as something they want to see? So absolutely, there's a balance to be struck. We have some things around elevating the big screen experience, which are very much around energy and imagination than they are around financial resource. And then on the second day, we do have a couple of cinema technology sessions, which undoubtedly, are around not so much the here and now, but what might be coming down the line and what might cinema operators need to think about in terms of future investment.
Yeah, I want to touch on that as well. Our colleague from Celluloid Junkie, Helen Budge, is moderating a panel on that day too on that future of cinema technology. You've got folks from Barco, Samsung, Christie Digital, and Odeon speaking in that panel. Could you give us a quick sort of preview on what that's about? Because to say it would be a sales pitch isn't doing service of what you guys are going to be discussing at the event.
Yeah, and we're always very keen to avoid sales pitches, and we're always very grateful for those people whose job pretty much 24/7 is to be in sales mode, who take an hour or maybe 90 minutes out of that 24/7 and put their company hats to one side and talk objectively about the technology rather than that their brand is better than brand, A, B, or C. And this is really intended to be, yes, something which looks at what the objective benefits are of, HDR, or we're going to go into a world of acronyms here. I'll say premium large format. Obviously, Samsung are now leading the charge in terms of LED screens, etc. But having done that, there'll then be a discussion, and we, as well as Mike Bradbury from Odeon, we've asked a colleague from one of the smaller chains also to get involved. Is what does this technology mean to you if you're running a cinema? How can you monetize this? How can you market this to an audience? Will an audience, frankly, notice if you have some of this technology in compared to what you're currently using? And so, it's not intended for people always to be the devil's advocate, but it is intended to kick what I would say is kind of kick the tires on this technology and get people, yes, to understand what it might bring in terms of the audience experience and all its many aspects, but also then to start thinking about, okay, if that is the case, how do we make that part of the business model? How do we make that something which can recoup its costs in 2, 3, 5 years, etc.? So, I think it's always very important if you have these kind of sessions around technology to, it does sometimes attempt to kind of anchor the balloon to the ground, but to bring it back to the basics of, technology for technology's sake isn't something necessary that cinema industry could ever afford, and certainly can't afford now. So it needs to be something which, really is rooted in the business and certainly in terms of the audience experience.
And there's a direct line in that panel to the next one on day 2 on AI in film and cinema. Now, when you say AI in exhibition, my first response to that is View International. We know that they've had great success in programming through AI. That's been very well reported in recent months. Could you speak a little bit about the wider conversation of how AI is being used in the cinema industry in the UK and some of the panelists that are going to be speaking on that?
Clearly, kind of AI is of the moment, and it's almost impossible to pick up a newspaper or open a screen without some mention of AI. And my general sense is that this is kind of, and I don't mean this in a sinister way, this has kind of crept up on us, and there's a conflation between machine learning and AI and a whole range of other, kind of IT-enabled processes. And so the things tend to get conflated. The thing which prompted us to put this on the panel was twofold. One was the fact that David Hancock of Omdia had produced a very digestible and a very interesting headline report of this, which he published a month or so back. But also, and we're absolutely not people who chase controversy, but also some of the noise around The Brutalist, where right. The editor of The Brutalist had given an interview where he, I think innocently, just said that they'd used AI to tweak the Hungarian accents. And we almost immediately, I have more than, so we're a broad membership organization and very few things surprise me these days. But I have more than one of our smaller members come to us and say they've been approached by audience members who'd asked that in future, if films have AI in their production, this is flagged up on their listings. The inference being that they didn't want to see a film that had been made with AI.
And, this is the first time I hear of something like this. This is really interesting.
And me too. But clearly this is not the blunt way you would say go back to that, a concerned member of the audience. But the reality is, it's almost impossible to think of a film which appears on screen now which doesn't have AI somewhere in the process. It may not be what appears on. Right? Yeah, it may not be. It may not be. I mean, certainly CGI. It may not be what appears on screen, but certainly in terms of the production and distribution. So I thought,
Mark Ruffalo doesn't look that way. His skin isn't green. He doesn't work out that much, right?
You can imagine. He wouldn't get the rom-coms if he did. But the reality is that and this is it was intended to be. This is intended to be, yes, a discussion, but also almost an educational piece. And so what we've got David presenting the headlines of his report in brief headline, but then we have colleagues from exhibition and distribution and post-production talking about their use of AI or AI-like technologies. And I think it's worth almost bringing everyone up to the same line, as it were, of understanding that this isn't, clearly, depending where you are in the value chain. If you're a script writer, I probably suspect that AI is more of a concern to you than if you're someone running a cinema. I would probably say, essentially. But let's take a step out of the fact we're talking about the cinema business. It's something which is increasingly affect every aspect of our life. And it's something that, unless we are willing to embrace it and manage it, will just become an object of fear, as it seemed to do around The Brutalist, to be perfectly honest. So that's the nature of the discussion. With some of the panels, I kind of know the way they'll go. But I'll be as interested as anyone to see how this panel plays out, because I don't have certainly in terms of the films before they arrive in the cinema, I don't really have much of an overview of what the level of current AI kind of involvement is. So it would be interesting to me as much as anyone, I think.
Yeah, and I think for everyone in the industry, we really don't know where this is going. Ultimately, it's down to engaging with your customers and making sure that they are well informed and comfortable with what they're watching. I think that makes perfect sense. And getting to these conversations early, you don't want to be caught unaware in any of these topics. And it's confusing for all of us. You have other sessions here that I find very interesting. There's something called the Cinema Club that in the program really stood out to me. Could you tell us a little bit more about this initiative?
Over a period which predates the pandemic, but which actually has probably accelerated post the pandemic, we've had a number of our smaller members come to us and, aware of Cineworld's unlimited subscription scheme and Odeon's limitless subscription scheme, and basically said to us, how do I go about this? How do I set up my own subscription scheme? Who do I need to speak to at the studios? And put bluntly, and sometimes it's probably better to do that than prolong the conversation. We've said to those members that if you're a single screen cinema, operating somewhere in the shires of England, it is not worth the studio's time, frankly, having a conversation with you about a subscription scheme which may involve 2 or 3 dozen cinema goers, simply because the bandwidth involved for them in negotiating what the rental might look like on a subscription scheme, et cetera, isn't sufficiently engaging. At the same time, we're aware that in Denmark in particular, but also now in Sweden, there have been a couple of very successful subscription schemes stroke membership schemes. In Holland, there's a scheme called Cineville, which is a subscription scheme, which brings together 2, 3, or 4 dozen small independent cinemas into a collective whereby a cinema goer pays a subscription and can get, almost unlimited access to all of those cinemas over a period of time, etc. And we at last year's conference, a representative of the Danish Cinema Club, the kind of forerunner of this, spoke, and there was a lot of interest in there. Or there was I think people struggled to translate the approach that was taken there to something that necessarily could work in the UK. But a couple of brave people who are in the audience who were already involved in the industry, but in other aspects, came together and they've developed the model essentially. So they're they're in the midst of what they tell me are very positive discussions with the studios. We recognize that one of the challenges we have as an industry, certainly in the UK, and I dare say in many other territories, is frequency of cinema going. Mm-hmm. We've kind of got back most, if not all, of the people who we thought we would get back after the pandemic, but they're just going less frequently than they did previously. When you discussed it earlier, part of that is about the strikes and the impact of those on the slate and our ability as cinemas to put in front of people films they want to see. Part of that is around economics, cost of living issues for people, etc. So essentially, the people from the Cinema Club, I'm glad they've not called it the Cinema Club UK, but the people from the Cinema Club, they will be speaking at the conference, just giving people an update on where they are, and conscious that they'll be speaking to an audience where a significant number of people in attendance will be smaller operators, really just, asking them to consider coming along for the journey. to be honest. We as a trade body need to be very mindful of competition issues.
Yep.
So we don't get, we represent, let's say 94%, it may be a little bit more than that, of the UK cinema sector. So we can't get involved in the commercial activities of our members, for a whole variety of reasons, not least expertise, but certainly competition as well. So for a third party to act as the kind of grit in the oyster on this and potentially bring together a group of like-minded smaller operators so they can achieve critical mass and develop something which is both of value to them, but also is even more so of value to audiences, I think is something we would see our role as supporting, even though, it's absolutely down to every individual cinema company or cinema venue to decide whether or not they want to be part of this.
No, you spoke about how frequency is something from the pre-pandemic era that we're trying to get back at. And I love this idea in terms of working with smaller operators to make sure that they can learn from each other and launch something that works for them. Another aspect from the pre-pandemic period that I'd love to see us getting back to as an industry is sustainability. It felt like 2018, 2019, we were getting great progress. Of course, 2020 happens and everything is about, let's say, single use, right? Better safe than sorry. And sustainability, unfortunately, took a back seat. Now, that's changing again. And one of the panels here, you're taking a spotlight on day 2 of the conference on focusing on a reusable cup program from the Irish-based exhibitor Omniplex.
Previously, our conferences have focused on one particular aspect of the business, so marketing or technology or data. And in 2023, for the first time, we had a 2-day event which was solely around issues of sustainability, energy use, resource use, carbon footprint, et cetera, et cetera. And I have to say, going into that, we were a little nervous about how it would land. Coming out of that, we were delighted by how engaged and enthused people were. And one of the things that came out of it particularly was a desire amongst the small and medium-sized cinema operators for more small C collective action on this, because they recognized that while they could do what they could do, a good deal of the progress to be made would be by putting pressure or working with partners and suppliers. And if you're a single site screen somewhere in the shires of England, I'll use that phrase again, you going to a big supplier and saying you need to do things differently probably isn't going to be a message which is heard. But if it's a larger footprint, as it were, of members. So off the back of the 23 conference, we began a process which is coming to a kind of one of its key milestones, which was around establishing what we called a roadmap to net zero for our sector. We were conscious of the fact that there were some other sectors which were more progressed than ours, hospitality being one of them, but also the fact that, we needed to provide the framework into which our members' existing activity could fit, but also to ensure that everyone came to the same level of understanding of where the hotspots in every sense were in the industry. That process has taken longer than we would have liked, but that is because our members quite understandably have been dealing with a whole range of other challenges in the period since then. But we're at a stage now where we have the basic framework, we think, of what the industry needs to do. And the process now is to have discussions with our larger members and some others about, what activities they're taking and how they fit within that. But that's not to say, and we've never said that, we declare kind of year zero on all the other activity that's out there. So colleagues at Omniplex have been very farsighted and very progressive in identifying one of the key challenges for our industry, which is around disposable cups. If you go into, I've had the joy of working on National Cinema Day for the last couple of years, and I will have empty drinks cups ingrained on my brain forevermore as I walk into an auditorium, particularly after a kids' film, etc. So, one of the things I think that colleagues at Omniplex have recognized is that one of the things which has held the industry back to a degree in terms of some of its actions is what might be the impact of making some of these steps on the economic bottom line. And what the guys at Omniplex will demonstrate is that you can square that circle. You can do something which both reduces the environmental footprint of your activities, but also something which reduces your costs because it reduces your own resource use, etc. And no one is suggesting this is gonna, this is not the answer to all of the industry's ills in this regard. But we wanted to shine a light on it because we wanted to show that while we continue to, paddle our canoe in the background, there is still very, very good activity which people can pick up and learn from.
Well, Phil, thank you so much for your time. That's Phil Clapp, the head of the UK Cinema Association, speaking about the UKCA's annual convention happening on March 18 to 19. Phil, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure, as always.
And that was Phil Clapp, the head of the UKCA, joining us here on the Box Office Podcast. Earlier, you heard Chad Kennerk interview Novocaine directors Dan Burke and Robert Olson. And even earlier than that, we went over the news with our colleague, Rebecca Pahle. Thank you again for listening, and we will talk to you again next week.